So, what's the idea of the papacy? Where does it kind of find its origins in scripture and in Christian tradition? Today, we're going to continue our series, kind of giving our thoughts on the election of the new pope with the question of sort of the Old Testament parallels and concepts, the Christian parallels and concepts that go into the papacy. This is Eric Slawick, the UWM Penn guy.
This is Alex Burks.
And this is Penn Guy Podcasting. And so last time we left off starting to transition into the question of what I've come to discover over time is the key question surrounding Catholic distinctives, what makes the Catholic tradition distinct. And I guess to a certain extent, the things we're talking about in this episode will also cover Eastern Orthodoxy. But this magisterial high church liturgical idea of which the papacy is the apex in Catholic thinking. So where would you say, like, what offices in the Old Testament is this kind of continuing or paralleling?
Sure. So the first thing to understand is that God is by his nature diffusive, meaning that he does not wish to bear himself within himself. He wishes to extend himself into other beings, to magnify himself. And what is he? He's love, right? So God's love is diffusive. And in a lesser way, his authority is diffusive as a means to extend that love more abundantly. So all of that to say, ideally, before the fall, you had Adam in the garden, and Adam exercised complete authority over the garden in union with the authority of God, right? So he had overseership, which isn't a word, but he oversaw the garden completely with God's authority, and he exercised almost absolute authority over the garden. This isn't really a matter of dispute. So after the fall, so on and so forth, right? We see various prophets rise again and again and again. We get to the establishment of the people of Israel. What is the ideal when we get to the establishment of the people of Israel? We see, ideally, a reversal to the Edenic system. The other nations had kings ruling over them, and God, just like he ruled over Adam, and Adam ruled absolutely over the earth, wished to rule over the people directly. They, however, in their ignorance, desired a king. So is what it is. Now they have a king. But it was not a blessing. It was a curse. However, God being good and omnipotent brings about faults for greater good. In the Catholic Church, we have this idea of a felix culpa, means a happy fault. So the bequeathal of a king upon Israel was a felix culpa, right? Because it was through the line of kings, especially through the line of David, a king after God's own heart, we see arising the line of Christ. So they reject God's authority. They ask for a king. They're given a king as a curse. However, God turns this curse to a greater advantage, where he uses the line of David to bring about his own entrance into history, that being the incarnation. Long way of saying we have Christ. Who is Christ in Christian theology? Christ is God himself. Christ, in many ways, he establishes himself as ruler over all of the earth once more. So God claims his rightful place as king once again. However, when we look towards the line of David, which Christ is descended from, what do we see? Does David rule as a monad above the kingdom of Israel? No, he diffuses his authority, just like God diffuses his authority. So what do we see in Christ? He diffuses his authority, just like David diffused his authority to Eliakim unto the apostles. What does this mean for us in the 21st century, or even before the 21st century as Christians? I would say, and the Catholic Church would say that you need a single leader of any group in order for it to function effectively. I think we can all agree on that. We see that in politics. We see that in other places. Democracy has its time and place, but in order to break deadlocks, in order to be more efficient, you need a greater centralization of power. And I'm not saying greater centralization is good or bad. I'm just saying it's an actual function of running an organization. So we see the Pope as maintaining this line of diffusive power. Christ is king. He, as Eliakim was, is the overseer of the house. He is his prime minister. He is his vice president. He is his second in command, so on and so forth. So Christ is reigning in heaven. on earth, what do we see? A human person who is a sinner, who is flawed, exercising the authority of Christ temporally in time, sometimes in union with his own merits, right? When we have a holy pope, that's a beautiful thing for the church, sometimes in spite of them. And we have to look at instances where we believe the pope, who is the successor of St. Peter, who holds the keys as Christ gave Peter the keys, who can speak infallibly, does really terrible things, right? And we have to bear that tension and try to bear it well. We'll see how it goes. So I hope that answered your question.
I mean, yes, it did. And some of that genuinely was threw a couple of curveballs at me. That, I mean, like, I actually, wow. I mean, the irony is almost off the charts for me right now, because
what's that?
without making this a debate program, my own perspective on the Israel selecting or Israel asking for a king and Israel receiving first Saul and then David. I think I don't consider myself reformed, but I'm broadly speaking reformed in my thinking. And the reformed idea tends to think of this as, I mean, it certainly was the bringing of something good out of something evil. I don't think anyone can deny that. But I've always seen that entire, and then later in Hosea, God reinforces this notion of just how much they were not supposed to ask for a king by saying, I gave you a king in my anger and I took him away in my wrath. And so my view of the thing itself is almost wholly negative. And actually, I'm in the process right now of posting videos on the Bible commentary side of this channel, dealing with this exact question of leadership. And I have two categories I call leadership by authority and leadership by character, which I basically, I mean, I'm sure many other people have made, I've spoken of these categories, but as far as I know, I kind of made these terms up myself. But one referring to that idea of inherited leadership, that you simply possess by means of a charism or by inheriting a monarchical office, or being an emperor of Rome, for example, who chooses the next emperor, or perhaps in Rome's later history, just simply fought your way to the top of the heap and took it by force, which also happened much later in the history of especially the northern kingdom of Israel. After the time of David and Solomon, there were constant feuds and infightings and coups and insurrections, and it was part of what God ultimately, by letting that whole lunacy run amok, was what God used to kind of bring them low and put them in a position where they were easy pickings for the Assyrian superpower that was rising out of the east. And this whole thing, to me, is an indicator of why single man government is not the ideal. I do genuinely believe that the American government is a culmination of sort of the providential development of human thought. I'm not obviously suggesting it's perfect. It's far from perfect, but it has the right idea and builds an entire system of checks and balances on that fundamental idea. And so, legitimately speaking, without making this political, I kind of see and so I guess to carry it over into the church, I kind of see similar principles as the ideal, and that's why it kind of threw me for a loop. This might just be us setting up for a future program we were planning on doing anyways about monarchy, except that I do think it carries over into the question of church government. And maybe I'll just ask then, for now, are there checks and balances in place in any way? If there aren't, that doesn't necessarily prove or disprove anything, but just as a matter of exploring the subject.
The checks and balances are God. And that sounds very unsatisfying, but it's just Christ told us the gates of hell won't prevail against the church. And so this is where faith comes in, where you say, all right, I'm yoking myself to this institution that it makes a lot of claims about itself. And it's beautiful and also a little bit nerve-wracking because you're like, this is a tall order, and Catholicism adds a little bit more to the Christian cake, not in terms of essential basics of Judeo-Christianity, but just as far as the Christian message is concerned, there's a lot more going on in Catholicism. So this is where I would say as a Catholic, I just have faith that the Pope won't get up tomorrow, which he could do, and write off a letter that infallibly proclaims something that previously was absolutely magisterially taught. Now, there have been instances where you get magisterial things that are somewhat difficult to synthesize, but they don't like abjectly contradict each other. And those are instances where you just have to sit and there is a way to work through them, and theologians have worked through them. And it's not like black and white. It's more like, this is a little bit gray. That's what this means on the ground. But I don't think the Pope has ever done anything. Like, to me, if the Pope came out tomorrow and said, we can now allow the priests to marry homosexual unions, that would contradict 2,000 years of church teaching. No Pope has ever in any way promulgated Catholic gay marriage. And for a Pope to do so, it would break the system. There are other things that are far less influential, but there's still some questions how this works. But generally speaking, everything's been fine.
Okay. Now, not to go too deep into the council, but that's obviously the most famous sort of example, as I've been able to gather, listening to Catholics, of where, and it's ironic that although I know Francis threw out some real zingers that have caused headaches and difficulties and required a lot of work. My impression is that nothing causes more hand-wringing and need for clarification than the Council of Vatican II. The Council of Vatican II. And so maybe, I know this is a massive subject to cover in 2 minutes of discussion, but just as an example, because that council was overseen by a pope, right?
Yes.
And would we, to borrow the categories from the previous episode, would that be considered magisterial and some level of infallible?
Absolutely. Yes.
It would. Okay.
All papal councils, or all councils, oversaw it and promulgated, officiated over by the Bishop of Rome, are magisterial unless expressly stated otherwise. But I couldn't think of an instance where that would be the case. But yes.
Okay.
Also, there are different types of councils. I don't know the distinction off the top of my head, but some councils might have less binding. But this was an ecumenical council, which means like binding on the whole church.
Okay. I hate to do this because I realize things need context and nuance, but in 2 to 4 minutes, are you able to, and we'll kind of close this segment with this question because it's kind of the primary example. Are you able to kind of sketch out why Vatican II has been so controversial, and maybe what you believe its intention was and the proper interpretation of it?
So, long story short, there are a ton of councils. This is a convening of a great majority or a vast number of bishops. And this session of bishops, overseen by the Pope, can either clarify doctrine, they can change vast sweeping elements of the faith's practice. Obviously, nothing insane. A council couldn't get together and say, like, blue is the best color infallibly, na boo boo. Like, that'd be weird. That doesn't happen, right? And there have been loads and loads and loads of these councils called ecumenical councils. And there was Vatican I. The thing about Vatican I, though, is I believe it was the Italian civil army came in and invaded the Papal States, and so Vatican I never finished. It was never ended. And so Pope Paul VI comes and he basically says, now is the time for, I forget the word in Italian, but basically he said, updating or checking in or reassessing, something along that lines. And so he calls the Second Vatican Council. And it formed a pretty severe and substantive, not rupture, but reform of the church's life in almost every way. Now, substantive, definitively, not really. I mean, you can't really have that. The council just couldn't up and change everything, but there's a lot of things in particular. The big thing that impacts most laity is the liturgy was changed. So the way we worship God was radically changed. But basically, we saw the posture of the church going from more straight and narrow to a little bit broader, a little bit more open, a little bit more liberal. It has too much political connotations, and I don't mean liberalization, but the church wanted to liberalize in a healthy, progressive way of saying, let's get back to fundamentals, let's get back to what we're really doing here, and let's kind of dust some of the cobwebs off, let's open some of the windows, let's get some sunlight into the room, as opposed to being more shut off and rigid and self-referential. And for better or for worse, that's what the council attempted to do. And I think that the documents and what the church actually presented to the worldwide universal church was very beautiful. What happened in practice with this opening up was not so, mainly because of the time frame this was happening. Mid 60s through mid 70s was not necessarily a time of geopolitical or stability in America. Was not a time of stability and referring to norms. It was the high flying age of Aquarius. The American side was going through a lot, and so a lot of people took what the council said and used it to their own means, and the church hasn't necessarily reined in as much as a lot of more moderate and conservative Catholics might have hoped.
Okay, so this is a good example of the way that the Pope and the magisterium work on the ground. Then you would say that they like, was there specifically, was there anything in the context of the times that motivated or put the idea in the minds of the leadership of the church and the Pope that it was time for a change in emphasis, shall we say?
I mean, of course, the Second World War had ended about 15, 20 years before this. The first atomic bomb had been dropped. You had social, political upheaval, just ravishing the world. You know, I could see Pope Paul VI saying, we as a universal church should focus on looking at the world, maybe with a little bit more of our sleeves rolled up. You know, we shouldn't necessarily try to keep things in the tower, in academia, in the Vatican. We should try to maybe reach back into the early Christian roots and get a church who is a little bit more connected to her foundations, as opposed to things that only concerned herself in maybe superficial matters, right? Does that make any sort of sense? There's a lot of stuff going on in that time period.
Yeah, okay. And so you would, as a Catholic, would argue that this is the value of having a magisterium, is the ability to dynamically adapt and respond to the various currents of culture and history. And although I would certainly say it brings a whole ton of new issues into bear, maybe on a future program we can delve into that controversy. But does that thumbnail it out reasonably well?
Absolutely.
Okay, so then I'll wrap it up for this one, and in the fourth and final episode of our series responding to the election of the new Pope, I'd like to bring this back around to Leo XIV and maybe some speculations about where the culture of the times might end up leading him, and how this would or would not impact the universality of the Universal Catholic Church. So until next time, then, this is Eric Slay with the UWM Pen Guy.
This is Alex Burks.
And this has been Pen Guy Podcast.